It's a work of historical fiction. 1,600 pages, I'm told, roughly, give or take,
Yes.
depending on who's published it. But over 10 years time to write it.
Yeah.
The three books that make up the Ibis trilogy, The Sea of Poppies, which came out in 2008, which was shortlisted for the Man Booker. River of Smoke came out in 2011, which was shortlisted for the Man Asia Prize. And now, the most anticipated book of this year, from any South Asian writer, I have to say, is Flood of Fire, the final part of this trilogy, which I do hope will win a major award. The books are set in the first half of the 19th century. Two major historical phenomena act as a backdrop to this plot, the entire plot of the Ibis trilogy. The Great Experiment, which involved the transport of indentured labor from India to work in the sugar plantations in other parts of the world, Mauritius. And the trade of opium between India and China. The research you've done about this part of this period of time in world history, it would be great for you to share. How did this come about? What is the setting of this aspect of history?
Well, for me, the Ibis trilogy really began as a book about departures, and I suppose it's partly because I myself have been traveling away from India so very often, but I became very interested in this whole question of how was it that Indians first began to leave India, because it's a curious thing that today the Indian diaspora, the Chinese diaspora are the two largest diasporas in the world, really. But actually, the Indian and Chinese diasporas are quite recent. They really date back only to the early 19th century. Whereas if you think of the European diasporas, they go back many, many centuries, Similarly, when you think of, say, the Arab dispersal, that again is something which happens very, millennia or more ago. So I became very interested in this question of how did it happen? How did it originally start? How did people like you and me end up, in different parts of the world, and so many of us here? How was this process set in motion? And I became interested particularly when I was writing The Glass Palace in the whole history of indenture, So I had, a book always starts with people and characters, and I had these ideas for a couple of characters, especially Diti, who's a central character in Sea of Poppies. She was a very strong character for me right from the start. And when I started writing Sea of Poppies, I tried to think of the background, I tried to imagine the background, from which such a person might enter the indenture. And that was when, looking into the sort of factors of, what existed here, what was happening then that sent so many people, millions of people just flooding away. Because if you think about it, one of the strangest things about the Indian indenture is that, when you look at diasporas elsewhere, when you think of, say, England or France or something, in England, so many of the English who left, who went to America, for instance, or Australia, they're from Cornwall and Devon and other coastal areas, and that's the same in France, A lot of the people who left were from Normandy or Brittany and so on. But in India, the diaspora starts in the deep interior, in this Bhojpuri-speaking region, around Patna, Ghazipur. And this became a strange question to me, because usually diasporas should start along the coasts. It's from the coasts that you would expect people to leave. So why was it suddenly that, in the early 19th century, suddenly these millions of people get up and, set off across the sea, which is an unknown element to them. And actually, they were terrified of the sea. They used to call the sea the Kala Pani, which is the black water. So there was a real fear, of the sea, of crossing the sea. So when I started researching the background, the thing that really jumped out was that this was exactly the area where the British, from the late 18th century onwards, were expanding opium production. This Bhojpur region essentially was the area between Patna and Benares. This became the area where the British were massively sort of expanding opium production. because they faced a balance of payments problem with China. Tea had become a huge commodity in Britain, but the Chinese would only accept silver, and Britain was running out of silver. So the leaders of the East India Company actually sat down in Calcutta and thought of this devilish scheme. They said, "Oh well, we must get the Chinese addicted to opium." I mean, really, it was like that. And so first they sent off a few crates. And if you look at the graph of how the opium production expands in India, it's astonishing. It's like this. So by 1839, China is actually facing this tsunami of opium, coming towards it. But again, as I said, when you expand the cultivation when you create a certain kind of monoculture, obviously it massively disrupts sort of local life and so on, So I think that was a part of what was happening there, that, opium production and the displacement of people sort of went hand in hand. We know, for example, that in 1857, during the Great Mutiny, the cultivation of opium was one of the principal articulated grievances, of the mutineers. So, that was really how my interest in this field, in this entire sort of history started. And once I got into it, really, it became clear to me that almost everything I knew about Indian history was really not so closely related to the reality of people's lives. It was something else that we were learning.
Some of the characters in the trilogy, which are fascinating. You have Bihari peasants, you have the Laskar sailors, you have Bengali zamindars, landowners, you have the Parsi businessmen that you just mentioned, you have the boat people from Canton, you have the British traders and the officials. You even have a Cornish botanist.
Yes.
And you also have a French sort of person who was looking for exotic flowers, I think in one of the characters. Where do you get inspiration for these characters? Where have you met these people? Have you read about these people? Where do these ideas come from?
Sometimes characters come just straight out of your imagination. Sometimes they have more complicated genealogies. Sometimes you just meet people and then a little bit of them stays in your head and you put it together and they slowly grow from a nucleus.
And as a bit of a teaser to those who haven't yet, nobody here has read the final book, which of the characters have carried on through into the Diti's there? I
Yes, Diti's been a constant, absolutely.
One of the other things in the first two books I've read, I found fascinating was the use of language. And when I go to literary festivals in India, Jaipur or Calcutta or others like that, which I've had the privilege of being at, and I hear panelists talk, and they're talking in English, but every now and then they'll throw in the odd Hindi word or the old Bhojpuri word or something, Urdu word, and I always feel for the sort of the non-Asians sitting there, and I wonder, will they understand what's being said? Can they get a sense of it? But they do, because they see it in a wider context. And similarly with South Asian literature, increasingly now, so much English and so much other things are going into these books. And you very openly used vocabulary, words from all these different languages, Malay and Hindi and so forth, and also dialects as well. How when you're writing, is that something you're conscious of? Or is it something that just flows naturally? You just think, well, this is the character, this is what they would say, and that's why these words are there.
Where do you decide that it's Malay or English, for example? Because, many South Asian writers, I see them, let's say, italicizing certain words. They'll italicize a word like masjid, for example, meaning mosque. But the word masjid is in the Oxford English Dictionary. So if you're italicizing that, what do you do about something like, say, seersucker, which is also from Hindustani, or calico, or muslin. There are so many words. I mean, or admiral. What do you do? Do you italicize admiral because it's from Arabic? So that's a kind of infinite regress. I don't even know how you would draw these lines. I mean, like you're saying that I'm using words from Hindustani, for example, but actually all those words are in the longer Oxford English Dictionary.
Yeah.
So when people say to me, your books don't have a glossary, I say, actually they do. It's the longer Oxford English Dictionary. Just look it up, just Google this word, you'll see. It'll take you straight to the Oxford English Dictionary. So, what is actually the case is that 19th century English was very, very subtle, and especially very absorptive of influences of many, many different kinds from many different places. 19th century English was in many ways, I would say, more cosmopolitan than contemporary English, because the great dictionary projects actually had the effect of freezing vocabulary. Whereas vocabularies were much, much more dynamic, in the 18th and 19th centuries. And that's a very striking thing about 18th and 19th century English, that it was able to absorb so many different words. And it wasn't just English. I mean, so much of, ordinary usage in Hindustani comes from, say, Portuguese, say, for example, a word that we use very commonly in India, balti. Now, all of you know what balti means. It means bucket. But it actually comes from Portuguese, and it came through a nautical language, because it originally meant ship's bucket. It was a bucket that was used on a ship. So there are all these words that, so there's this enormous sort of linguistic exchange going on. Yeah. There's exchanges of many different kinds going on. There's a musical exchange, there's an enormous botanical exchange, which I write about at great length in River of Smoke. So, this is a very fecund moment in many ways, and, it's easy to sort of think, looking back on it now, that it was the West exporting stuff, but it was very much also the other way around. Yeah. So you do see this kind of intricate sort of interweaving.
Do you speak other languages other than Hindi, Bengali, yes. English?
Yes, of course. Well, I learned Arabic, and I speak some French. So yes, I have several languages. Yes.